I'm Sasha Swift.
And I'm Alex Thomas.
This is Titles Mean Nothing. It's a brand new podcast, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, it's all very exciting.
Yeah. It's your first time podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, who are you?
I'm a non-binary legal consultant person that lives in the Midlands and likes movies and books and stuff. The same stuff most people like.
And your pronouns are?
They and them, with a hint of he sometimes.
Hint of
Recently.
he. Yeah, definitely. I'm Sasha Swift. I'm she, her. I am a video professional, and me and Alex have only known each other for maybe, what is it now?
3-4 months then.
3-4 months. And we are in a relationship.
Ooh. It seems to be the way in which people do meet nowadays, but Tinder, all the swiping. I think you said the other day you had carpal tunnel in your thumbs. Maybe it's from all the Tindering. Historic Tindering, I hope.
RSI. Yeah, so I remember swiping on Alex on November the 30th. I remember where I was. We were going to a Queen club night. And yeah, I swiped on Alex and we got talking and...
Haven't stopped talking.
We really haven't stopped talking since November the 30th, like every day. Two non-binary people in a relationship. How do you define that? It's not straight, it's not gay, or is it both?
I feel like how you define it depends very much on your position. How would the sun define it? It's interesting though, isn't it? Like we end up talking in these kind of binary ways about each other, and it's comfy in its respective ways. But even as non-binary people, like in terms of the language that's available to describe stuff, you know, you make words up or you just fall back on what exists. And it's not necessarily 100% accurate, but it's like you've got to work with what you got. So in terms of looking at what the podcast is going to involve going forward, we've not got a set theme or anything as such. It's a bit of a mix, quite eclectic so far, but we've got possible guests in mind. We've got themes, a lot of stuff looking at kind of media culture, I suppose, is like the gist thus far.
Yeah. One thing I really like is how pop culture from the past can inform like pop culture in the future.
So in terms of, you know, we've got a couple of musical topics that we're heavily invested in the research of already.
So we were trying to think of a podcast title, and I can't remember really what we came up with. Nothing stood out to us.
It's kind of variations on our name, but it was a bit
sickening.
Some of it.
Yeah. Two people sort of in a new relationship, sort of combining their names and things you don't want to hear. I was driving down an A road from Derby to Lichfield, and I was thinking about titles in the modern age, and I messaged Alex and I said, titles mean nothing.
And I mean, it was something we touched on before in terms of, I guess there's the whole like Shakespeare quote that's kind of bullshitty, but it does stand to reason, like what's in their name, that kind of idea. No matter what you call it, a rose is a rose. If something's shit, it's shit. But yeah, and we talked about kind of titles in the literary sense.
Yeah, for this we mean titles like prefixes for names. In my opinion, they've ceased to serve a purpose.
I think in terms of etymology, how language develops and what it can say about culture, how different terms have been used historically and how they've developed and changed is interesting. For me, personally, like I'm mixed in terms of my legal name, but it wasn't something I felt particularly passionate about at the time of doing. I know more now about the whole background and why some people do it and don't than at the time. At the time it was, I've got a list of options, none of them really fit, this one will do. Yeah. That thing of it not really having any emotional significance for me, I think is paralleled. As
a non-binary person, use MX, which is mux.
Yeah, there's a few different pronunciations. Most people go with mix, it seems. But some people, like you just did there, just say MX. For me, the connotation for that is like Malcolm X. They're not related in the slightest. But I think potentially for some people it could be viewed in a political way, in the same sort of thing, like a political statement, just to say, like, X, I'm crossing this out, I'm not going to be defined in these ways.
I don't like titles, and I don't really want to go by one in a way. So when we look at titles, what do they signify? For example, Mrs. Smith, what does that say about her?
Typically that she's married.
Yeah.
Although something I did find, when it came to like the mid-20th century, often Mrs. would be applied to women regardless of their marital status, and it was more to do with respect.
Mrs. Was for centuries applied to women of a higher social status, whether married or not.
Which was interesting in a way, because in my head it had always just been about marriage and being, the property of some man. That was the connotation I carried around that I really hated about the idea.
There's something that Amy Erickson also said, which was it's a case of ownership. So people who object to the terms Miss and Mrs. Argue that they define a woman by which man she belongs to.
Mm-hmm.
If a woman is Miss, she belongs to her father. If she is addressed as Mrs., she belongs to her husband. And that's when things like, Ms. come in, MS. It was brought in sort of the early 1900s to be the equivalent to Mr., which is kind of it's surprising that more people don't use that.
It seemed to be the case that Ms. was much more popular in the US. There was a lot more traction rather than here. When we were looking in the US, like you said, first came about in the early 1900s. First citation I could find for it was something called the Republican of Springfield, Massachusetts. A little later on, it picks up gradually, and then we see in the 70s that a magazine called Ms. is launched, and then Marvel have Ms. Marvel come out a couple of years after that, whereas the UK press, I sort of snorted when I read it because I was like, oh, typical. Quote from The Economist in 2016, warns that the title is ugly, with no real context as to why that might be. But there seems to be a bit of a shunning of it over here a little bit.
Yeah.
Particularly in the press, and, I don't know if it's to do with the left or right leaning. It seemed to come across that way in the quotes I could find.
The title Miss as well was something that was previously only, it was called to girls, young girls. And if you called an adult woman Miss before the 18th century, you'd be kind of implying she was a prostitute, which obviously isn't the case now. So that's another example of how titles changed. And we're mostly sort of talking about sort of Britain here and the United Kingdom in general, aren't we? Where else do we find titles, really? Because we find them in kind of like professional sort of ways. So that's kind of linking back to social status in a way, because, if you're a doctor, you're seen as of higher social status. At least in Britain today, there's a lack of social mobility, which means that, at any time legally, you're probably only going to be a Mr., a Miss, Mrs., Ms., or Mix. I mean, do you know any doctors personally?
Only ones that are friends with you.
Yeah, I know 2.5. Oh no, I know 3.5. Actually, I know more doctors than I think.
Maybe not the best example.
Yeah.
But even, I'm from working class background. I did do law at university, but I actually don't know anybody that practices. So actually has the recognition, for example, of barrister or QC, because, everyone our age, even if they've got a training contract, is still having to really hustle to even try and get anything close to that. So feasibly in a few years' time, I may know some esquires, some QCs, maybe some doctors also. But yeah, at the moment it does seem, and you mentioned about class, social mobility, perhaps there's a generational element as well. Religious figures as well comes into that.
Yeah,
so.
His Holiness, Reverend, Rabbi, Imam. If you don't subscribe to the same religious beliefs as other people who have those titles, then aren't those titles kind of essentially meaningless to you? So take a reverend. A reverend is referred to as such because the reverend is a member of the clergy, therefore ordained for religious duties, or consecrated, which means sort of declared sacred. But that's within their own system. He's only a reverend because of their belief system and what they believe. So that's kind of like, it could be seen as self-identifying within their own system, albeit it's recognised legally.
Yeah, and I mean that you mentioned before about sort of professors and that kind of thing. Again, within the legal community, you get QCs, you get esquire used frequently. And again, it's, it's different from a religious system, but it's this idea that a structure of some sort has been built, and that's how we recognise people. And something I was thinking about with the use of mix, historically, so it came back in the Middle Ages, when people couldn't write, to sign a document, they would mark it with an X. So feasibly, some people may use mix. I've not met anyone who does, but I could envisage that people could use it as a political or a class thing as well. So the idea that they are not subscribing to those institutions.
We're kind of subjected to a very binary view of gender, especially with official documents and things like that.
Yeah, so when mix got recognised in 2015 in terms of, the Royal Mail recognising it, quite broad recognition within banks. Largely there was quite a lot of good press around it, I found, even from media sources you wouldn't necessarily expect. However, potentially quite a telling quote. So within the House of Commons in 2015 as well, it was made quite clear that if an MP wanted to be referred to by mix, then that was fine, and the Speaker said that it was fine. Now, this is not necessarily the most reputable source, but the Sun reported that they'd overheard a comment made by an MP. They didn't disclose any names.
Oh yeah, the Sun.
Yes.
Yeah, very reputable.
The MP apparently said that the Speaker, John Bercow, made this change as part of his crusade for equality. So again, even those within the Houses of Parliament at that point in time, feasibly there was even a backlash within that institution, when the crusade for equality isn't really, if I was ever accused of being on a crusade for equality, I don't think that's necessarily a negative thing to have pinned to you.
The thing people forget about politically correct is it's got the word correct in because it's correct.
What is so bad about giving people dignity? Talking to them in a way that they are comfortable with.
Well, then it stops you from being an asshole. And for some reason people really like being assholes.
I mean, I think everybody can be an asshole, but there's ways and means. You can be genuinely funny about it rather than just intolerant and rude.
The idea, first of all, that male and female references are predominant on official forms and things. Even with the introduction of mix, we don't have legal recognition of non-binary people or people who don't sort of identify as male or female. Even though the NHS's gender identity service clearly supports the concept of non-binary, although the computer systems don't, and I know that for a fact because I used to help engineer them. Maria Miller, have you heard of her?
Yes.
So she's a Conservative MP of Basingstoke. In 2016, at the age of 51, so there's no generational arseholeness here, she was chair of a committee looking at transgender equality, and she was saying male and female references are unnecessary on official documents. A person's gender is not relevant on official documents, and it creates an unconscious bias in job and university applications. And although Maria is controversial in other ways, such as the expenses scandal, and even something she may have said about trans people, not necessarily everybody within the trans community agrees with. She's right. I mean, she is.
On that particular point,
yeah. On that particular point. And that comes through with the titles as well, because a title only seems to symbolise whether you're a male or female, or non-binary, or married, or of higher social standing than sort of someone else.
There's just no place for it anymore.
What is the need for a title, really? I certainly don't need to be addressed with a title, and when people do, it's generally wrong anyway. The first suggestion of mix on the internet was in July 9th, 1982.
A lot of the kind of message boards and web chats and stuff that would have been available in the 80s just isn't available anymore, so people have done a lot of digging to archive these sort of original sources. The information I found anyway was, rather than it necessarily being something that was coined by the trans community or non-binary folk, it was more to do with the feminist movement and what we were saying about the signifying whether or not somebody's married, in a similar way to Ms, but again Ms is quite gendered still, and and the idea of moving away and being just completely neutral.
I like that. If I had to choose a title, it would be that, being as though I have to subscribe to someone else's system of identifying. So the answer to our title's really important in 2019, you know, with the changing and widening definitions of gender, and I'd like to think that we were all being seen as more equal people in society, but that's just is simply not the case, especially with, I'm going to get preachy here, with a Conservative government. I don't think titles are important, and I think titles mean nothing, realistically. To other people they mean things, to me they don't mean anything. It's one of those things really where I actually don't care that much, really, but because we couldn't come up with a title for our podcast, we decided to call it Titles Mean Nothing, kind of just to prove a point. Did we do it? I don't know.
Do let us know your feedback. It'd be very greatly appreciated. Thank you.
I've been Sasha Swift.
I've been Alex Thomas.